All right, welcome to another episode of Playing with Research in Health and Physical Education. Risto here with George Mason University. Today, we have a special guest on to kind of explain to us a little bit about the Australian physical education curriculum. Things are obviously done in different ways in a lot of different places, and I think Australia has done a really good job with their curriculum in general. So Dr. Laura Alfrey is here today to kind of give us an overview, which is going to get linked to our next episode, which is about a paper that got published in Physical Education and Sport Pedagogy. So in order for us to kind of give a brief understanding of the curriculum, we'll have Dr. Alfrey here give an explanation.
Thanks, Risto. Before we start, it's probably useful to state that whilst there is this amazing Australian curriculum, each state and territory has made it their own, and we enact state and territory-based versions of the Australian curriculum depending on where we live and work. So I'm currently in Victoria, so that's the version of the curriculum that I'll be talking to today. So the Australian curriculum, just in terms of context beyond health and physical education, is described as a three-dimensional curriculum that recognises the three key dimensions, which is firstly disciplinary knowledge, skills and understanding, which is where health and physical education sits under that banner. The second dimension is general capabilities, of which there are 7, include literacy, numeracy, critical and creative thinking, intercultural understanding, for example. And then the third dimension is cross-curriculum priorities, and there are 3 of those, which include sustainability, Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia, and then thirdly, and really importantly, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. Drawing focus to the health and physical education curriculum, and I speak as someone who lives in the state of Victoria, as I said, it's characterised by 2 main strands, each with 3 sub-strands. So the first main strand is personal and social and community health, and the 3 sub-strands that sit under that banner are being healthy, safe and active, communicating and interacting for health and well-being, and contributing to health and active communities. The second main strand is movement and physical activity, and subsumed within that are the 3 sub-strands of learning through movement, understanding movement, and moving our body. In an attempt to have a broad and balanced curriculum, there are also 12 focus areas, or contexts for learning, we might call them, and these must be taught across every band of learning, a band being 2 years or grade levels. So focus areas include, for example, food and nutrition, health benefits of physical activity, games and sports, lifelong physical activities. And this stipulation, I think, is really vital, and it's a huge step forward in terms of curriculum. If we have any chance of disturbing the tendency to reduce what should be a broad and balanced health and physical education curriculum to a narrow focus on competitive team games, which we know from research is an ongoing issue. I digress. So there's lots of great things about the Australian curriculum for health and physical education, but one of the most exciting for me are the 5 propositions, or the key ideas as they are sometimes called. The intention is that the propositions inform pedagogy, and until now curriculum has only focused on what to teach, not how to teach it, which is why I think it's quite exciting. The propositions that the curriculum encourages to draw upon when planning and teaching our HP programs are as follows. The first one is focus on educative purposes. Although the curriculum may contribute to a range of goals that sit beyond its educative purpose or purposes, the priority for a health and physical education curriculum is to provide ongoing, developmentally appropriate and explicit and planned learning about health and movement. You might think that should go without saying, but that's another podcast, I think. The second proposition is take a strengths-based approach. And this links to your podcast with Mikhail at the end of last year. Rather than focusing on potential health risks or a deficit-based model of health, you will get fat, you will get an STI, you will die. This proposition urges us to acknowledge that all students and their communities have particular strengths and resources, and that they can be nurtured to improve personal, social, and community health, as well as physical activity. Importantly, the curriculum simultaneously prompts us to recognise that students have varying levels of access to resources, both personal and community, and that thus a one-size approach in any context will rarely be effective, either in terms of health, physical activity promotion, or education and learning.
Yeah, and sorry to jump in here and interrupt you, but I think that that is one of the great things about the curriculum, that it does take that strengths-based approach. And Mikhail's paper was about what he kind of hopes that health and physical education will become, and this is what's happening. And I know that in the US specifically, we talk about, individuals talk about taking a strengths-based approach in a lot of things, but it's definitely not written down as one of the 5 main propositions in our curriculum. So just as a side commentary here, I love that it's kind of a visionary thing that's coming together and actually being implemented somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, as you would know from talking to Mikhail, who's very knowledgeable in this area, salutogenesis, which has many overlaps with strengths-based approaches, is historically rooted, and it's been around for a long time, but it's really starting to get some traction now, which is really exciting. Obviously, we know the dangers of policy slippage, and just because it's in the curriculum, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to play out. But what I've seen, at least anecdotally, here in Melbourne, is for the first time I'm seeing teachers approach me, and the royal me, academics, my colleagues, and they're asking, what is this? How do we put it into practice? And so that's really exciting. Not only that it exists, but that teachers are excited about it. Some teachers. Okay, so that was the second proposition. The third one is value movement. Health and phys ed promotes an appreciation, obviously, of how movement in all its forms is central to daily life. And what this curriculum does, I think, in highlighting this notion of valuing movement, is it prompts us to look beyond movement as performance, which is an important component of any health and physical education program, but it shouldn't be the only kind of movement that kids are exposed to, in my view. And yeah, it pushes us towards rhythmic and expressive movement for joy and for its own sake. So that's the third proposition. The fourth one is develop health literacy. Health literacy can be understood as an individual's ability to access, understand, and use health information and services, ideally in ways that promote and maintain health and well-being of themselves and others. It draws heavily on Nutbeam's 3 levels of health literacy, those being functional, interactive, and critical. And there is lots of potential here for overlap with critical inquiry, which I'll talk about next. And if you're looking for a neat example of what health literacy might look like in practice, then have a look at Louise McQuaig's work from the University of Queensland. She's done some great stuff. And also the podcast, which links to this minicast, will also provide an example of what that could look like in practice. The fifth and final proposition, and the one that took centre stage in our paper, is include a critical inquiry approach. As the Australian curriculum for health and phys ed espouses, it expects us to engage students in critical inquiry processes that assist them in researching, analysing, applying, appraising knowledge in health and movement fields. And in doing so, the intention is that students will critically analyse, evaluate contextual factors that influence their decision-making and the decision-making of others, as well as behaviours and actions around health and movement, whilst also exploring issues such as inclusion, power inequality, assumptions and discourses. They don't use the word discourses, I did. Diversity and social justice. So, if the propositions, and I've presented the 5 there, focus on educative purposes, take a strengths-based approach, value movement, develop health literacy, and include a critical inquiry approach. If those 5 are mobilised as intended, and we know for that to happen, many stars need to align, then it's got the potential to do some really great work in terms of encouraging teachers and students to focus on education as well as the physical. And by the nature of critical inquiry approaches, as one example, it's impossible to enact those without moving towards student-centred approaches, which we know are fruitful in many ways.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and I think that those are really lofty goals, right? You know, covering the critical inquiry, covering social justice, and using a strength-based approach, talking about health literacy. How do you see this curriculum in general being played out in just a regular school, just like a random school in Australia? Is it being enacted, or are like 2 out of the 5 or 4 out of the 5 parts being enacted in most schools?
I can't talk for most schools. I tend to work with a cluster of schools really closely. If I am to look historically and perhaps pessimistically, you could argue there's a good chance of a great degree of slippage here, in that there is such a degree of separation between current practices and expected practices that some teachers might be jarred by that. That said, and as I said, I can only talk anecdotally here. I'm working with some amazing schools, one in particular, and it reflects what I said earlier around this excitement circulating around this curriculum. And I can't talk for all schools and all teachers, but the ones I'm working with are trying really hard to embed these 5 propositions in their planning. And it's not expected that these 5 propositions are used every lesson or indeed in every unit of work, but it is expected that across a whole scope and sequence or a whole health and physical education programme, and that we begin to see these alternative, in quotes, approaches to become more frequent in health and physical education.
And what about in teacher education programs? How has this been adopted by teacher education programs in Australia in general? Open arms, gung-ho, like let's do it? Or are there programs that are still a little hesitant on it? Or are they, all hands on deck kind of implementation on it?
I would say the ways in which Australian institutions have looked at this new curriculum is probably quite representative of the teaching population, in that, all teacher educations are different. We have different biographies and philosophies, ways of understanding what health and physical education is and should be. And some, I think, have adopted it with gusto, and it's embedded across their whole programs, and it's a real strong feature. Others, I'd say, would probably have been a little bit more resistant. And that's not necessarily because they don't think it's a positive move forward, but I know in talking to both other teacher educators and teachers, the willingness is not absent. What's absent is the tools to be able to enact these propositions. And that's what we've been doing. So myself and some colleagues here at Monash, Karen Lambert, Justin O'Connor, and Professor Dawn Penny, who's now at ECU, we've been doing a lot of work in this space. We've been working with pre-service teachers and teacher educators to develop resources to help teachers and teacher educators enact these propositions. So if you go to Monash Education on Facebook and scroll down and look for something typically health and phys edish, there's some videos that one for each proposition, which highlights what it could look like in practice. And we've had a really great feedback on that. We also developed a resource they're just called the proposition cards, and there's 5 cards in a little cardboard packet, and we've been handing those out to our students as well as teachers that we do professional development with and teachers we work with, and the feedback we've got is that they've been really useful in planning. So each card articulates the proposition, key questions that you would ask when working through the planning process. And we've had some good feedback from that. So we're in that space now of early mobilisation and enactment, and the things I'm talking about now are very similar to the kind of things that we'll talk about in the main podcast, but it's that process of policy enactment which is messy and contradictory, and we all need multiple layers of structural support to help us enact the vision.
Right. And I think that's a great transition, because the paper does talk about that enactment of policy and specifically into critical inquiry, and it does speak from the viewpoint of 3 teachers that actually tried to enact part of this. So I appreciate the time on this. So we'll kind of wrap this up, and then basically if you listen to this podcast before you get into the paper or vice versa, it's just giving you a little bit more depth into the Australian curriculum, and I thank you very much for sharing your expertise on this.
Thanks for having me.